So in this episode, we're going to be covering navigation in Flutter and also the ListView widget, which is a really important widget because most apps are made up of some kind of list view of stuff. It could be newsfeed items, photos, whatever. So, and finally, we're going to be covering GestureDetector also. So we're going to be implementing the second major screen of our app, the Tourism Co app, and you'll be able to browse through a list of locations and tap on one to get to this detail screen that we've already implemented here. So let's get started. If you want to follow the code and just get a copy of the code we're going to be implementing in this lesson, you can check out the repo at this blog post on fluttercrashcourse.com. It's called Navigation in Flutter, and there's a link for the code for this lesson up here, and you have to check out the branch step/step 06. So first thing we want to do is update our fixture data. So fixture data, again, is just test data, but we want to show a lot more locations so we can show this list view widget easily. We're also going to add a new field to the location model, which is ID. And what ID is going to do is it's a unique identifier that lets us pass around in our app so that we can load a given detail screen. So if I tap on location with ID 2, for example, I then make a call to my backend to say, hey, fetch me all the data for location 2. So we're not integrating with a backend quite yet, but that's the kind of code we're going to implement before we actually do that integration, just to wire things up. So you can check out the branch to just copy and paste this new location data if you want. I'm going to do that right now. So let's open our project. So we're going to open the location model, and right now we only have one instance of a location. So we're going to want to create 3. And before we paste that in, I'm going to actually implement this ID member. So int ID for location, and it's going to be an int. Different apps do use different forms of identifiers. Sometimes they use a string as a GUID, but in our case, we're just going to use an old-fashioned just int. So we have to update our controller here, our constructor rather, sorry. And then I'm just going to paste in what I have here to the side, and that'll be a lot easier. So boom, done. That's it. Let's make sure we have the images in our app. So every location refers to an image, so an image file locally. Later, we're going to be loading it from a URL. So right now, I don't have all the images. So I'm going to have to take the images from the branch called step/step 06, and I'm just going to copy it now off screen. So I've checked it out off screen. I'm going to copy it, and then I'm going to now paste it into the assets directory and the images subdirectory there. So I'm going to paste it in, and boom, they show up right here. So make sure you have these images here or else they won't show up. Great. So let's go back to my blog post. So as you know, in every lesson, I follow my blog post. So if you want to see the show notes, you can as I talk. Let me increase the size for you. So our fixture data is done. So next thing we want to do is implement a new screen, which is the location listing screen. And this is going to be a stateless widget because it's not going to need to maintain any state. And it's going to also use a scaffold, which is that that convenience widget that lets us create a new screen. And we're going to create a list view inside of it. And a list view basically takes in a list of items, whatever that is. It's just a bunch of data, and it will render those items and automatically let you scroll those items if it overflows the screen. So this is the boilerplate, as you see in front of you, for the list, how we would use list view. We would basically fetch all of our locations and pass it, map them, and we've covered map in the last lesson, so if you don't know about that, check it out. And for each location, we're going to display the location's name, period, and that's it. and then we're going to return a list for the list view. So let's continue on here. I will just implement it now, and we can build upon this. So we can add an image or make it tappable or whatever. So let's actually implement this. Okay, let's continue here. So open the so the screens directory shows all of our existing screens. Right now, there's one folder per screen. We already went over code organization. So this is how we're going to continue to organize our code. So I'm going to hit new folder, and we're going to call it locations, because it's basically a list of locations. And for naming your screens, you want to basically name them as simple as possible. You don't want to name it location listing. It's just too verbose. You can if you want, but it's just too verbose. So I'm going to call it locations, and because it's the main screen, I'm going to name it the same name as my directory, and that's really important to be consistent. So let's start implementing this. I'm going to paste in the boilerplate code for a stateless widget and also our imports. So I need to import app.dart and also the location model. So in terms of the simple screen, pasting that in, we want to use a scaffold. So I'm going to paste that in because we already went over this before. Let me increase the text size for you. And then I'm going to hide the left panel here so you can see it better. So the scaffold takes in a body, as you know, and let's go ahead and implement ListView. So I'm going to say ListView. And so there's different versions of ListView you can use. Right now we're going to use the traditional ListView constructor. There's some named constructors we're going to use later, but we'll cover that. So if you're used to ListView already and you're implementing it in a different way, just follow along and just see how I implement ListView. Because the main way to implement it is there is a children parameter, and that children parameter takes a list of whatever you want to render. So it's going to be a list of widgets at the end of the day. And for now, we're going to make it really, really simple. So let's go back to the example in the blog post. Right now, we're going to just implement a list of text widgets. So when I fetch my locations, I'm going to say map. And map is basically an anonymous function. So for each item in the map, which is a location, I'm going to execute the following function. And that function is going to return a widget that represents each item in my list view. So I'm going to return a text widget, and I'm just going to use the location name for the text widget. And then finally, I'm going to convert it back to a list, because map returns an iterable type, and that's more of an advanced type that you don't really need to know about right now, but you just have to convert it back to a list, because that's what children is. It's a list of widgets. So we have to save that, and let's see, I guess that's it. Let's see if that rendered. So I have my emulator open here, and we have the detail page open now. So now we have to update the app.dart to kind of show this view right here. So let's go to app.dart. And a shortcut for opening things in VS Code is Command P, or if you're on Windows or Linux, it's Control P. And then you just type the name of the file. So that's really useful. So basically, the home screen is now not going to be location detail. That was just there for example's sake. It's going to be now location. So let's update our imports. And I'm going to update this, save it. And now let me just do this here. Bear with me. That way you can see the code in the screen here. Cool. Now this is a very basic list view. It doesn't look really cool. It just shows like a single name, and that's it. There's nothing fancy about it. We're going to be adding an image for each item here later. So oops, I'm going to show you that. So I have the mock-up of like the actual end result of our app here, and I've showed it to you before. Let me open it for you here in a new window because it's not letting me show it to you. Let's see, location list. Yeah, so this is going to be our final list view we're going to implement. The list view is going to have one image per item, and it's going to have a widget at the bottom with the name, the opening times of the location, and just some subtitle. So that's what we're going to get to. So we're not going to render those images quite yet though. So great. Now let's cover how to interact with an actual list view item. So we're going to implement a gesture detector. And the gesture detector is something very basic in Flutter. Most other widgets already include the ability to detect a tap. It could be in the form of a button or whatever, but a gesture detector is the kind of parent type that's can be used for really any widget. So we can wrap anything with a gesture detector and actually pass on an anonymous method, and that method can do whatever we want. And in this case, we're going to navigate to the location detail screen. So let's implement a gesture detector. So basically, to implement a gesture detector, it's its own widget. So because it's just a widget here, let me just do a word wrap here. Word wrap, great. And I'm going to hide the left bar here. So it's another widget. So we can wrap the text widget here with a gesture detector. And a gesture detector has a child, which is going to be the actual thing. Let's see, child text there, and then end the parentheses here and save it. It's going to automatically format. And it's not going to do anything yet because we have to implement a new parameter here. So instead of only providing a child, there's another parameter you're going to provide, which is called onTap. And onTap let's click into it to see how you implement that. An onTap is a type of gesture tap callback. And if you tap into gesture tap callback, if you click into it, you're going to see it's just going to be a function, a general function. So you can click into this as much as you want to see how things are implemented, but just trust the process for now that it's going to be a actual function, anonymous function. And let's implement that now. So because it's just a generic function, it doesn't take any parameters. So we're going to do the parentheses here because without any list of parameters. And then the arrow here, the rocket notation. And now we're going to implement the function for onTap. And because it's a little bit more complex, we're going to pass it the name of another function so that we're not implementing the function right in here. With like a block. It's going to just get too messy. So we're going to implement a function called onLocationTap. So it's really important to name your functions very explicitly. So we're tapping a specific location. What's not ideal, in my opinion, is to name it something like handle tap or handle location tap. Well, I guess handle location tap's fine, but on location tap is something a little more concise. And it's already like explicit that it's a handler. So on location tap, I think is the best terminology. And it's important to be good about terminology when you code something because it makes sure that your code is nice and concise. Okay, so let's implement this now. We're gonna pass in the context. So as you're gonna see in a sec, we're gonna need to use this context variable. And what we're gonna do is pass in the ID of the location. What's important is we're not going to pass in the actual location because in Dart, it's going to make a copy of that location instance, and that's not really memory efficient. What we want to do is pass only the absolute minimum data we need to any function we're going to use because we don't want to copy actual entire object instances. So we're going to do that, and let's implement that method right now. So because this method doesn't return anything, we can say void on location tap, but what I usually do is I just leave out the void. If it's returning void, you can just omit that. And it passes a build context and then the location ID. And so what this is going to do is going to navigate to the new screen. So now let's talk about navigation next before we actually implement it. Okay, so before we start any implementation, let's just talk some navigation concepts. So in any mobile app, navigation works like a deck of cards, where every card in the deck is a screen. And when your app loads for the first time, it's only going to start off with one card because there's only one screen loaded. And that is defined in app.dart here in the Material app widget by the home parameter. And we already went over this, but that home is the starter screen for your app. So your app just starts, and it starts with one screen and one card in the deck. Now, when I tap on an item in my list view here, which we're going to implement, it's going to load a new screen. It's going to load the location detail screen, which is another card in your virtual deck of cards. And it's going to take that card and move it on top of the other card in your deck into the view for the user, so that you're pushing and popping cards at the end of the day. So it's basically, in computer science terms, a stack. And that stack, you can push more cards on top of the deck, and the card on the very top of the deck is what shows to the user. And when you want to go back, so let's say they tap the back button, that card slides off the top of the deck, and the previous screen is still there for the user. So the previous screen is still in memory. So when we define a series of screens in our app in Flutter and a lot of other kind of mobile frameworks, you're defining a list of what we call routes. And that borrows from web app development terminology, where a route is a basic URL that is a path to a page. So the home page route is just slash. Another screen route is like slash whatever. So in Flutter, you're defining routes, and these are called named routes because for every route, you're giving it a name. So let's define that. There's a parameter here in Material app called routes. Now, ultimately, we won't be using this parameter because I'll show you the shortcomings of it. But for very simple applications, it works really well because if you don't have any kind of like fancy context you want to pass to your new screen, it works fine. And I'll explain that in a sec. I'll explain what I mean by that in a sec. So let's open up the blog post to show you the example here. And I'm just going to copy and paste this in because it doesn't make sense to type it all out. So in a very, very traditional app, when we have routes, we have the slash as we can call it whatever we want, but it's usually using slash as the home screen. This is the first screen that loads, right? And instead of home, we can say like initial route, and we can just refer to that route by name because the name of that route is just slash. When we want to navigate to another screen, we have to first define that route to that screen, and that screen is like slash second or like foobar or whatever you want to name it, right? And to navigate to that screen, then I can refer to that screen by name or the route name. So I can say navigator pushed named context slash and then the name of the route. So going back to my detail page, if I tap on a location, I can say Navigator, which is to basically work with navigation in Flutter. There's a class called Navigator, and you say push names, which is a named route, and you pass it the build context and then the name of the route you defined. Very simple. Now, the shortcoming to this is like pretty clear because if your second screen needs to pass any parameters, if you need to pass any parameters to it, like foobar, whatever, like this, right? Where are you going to get the values to those parameters? That's a shortcoming because there's no way to define how those parameters, that data is going to get there if those parameters are dynamic. So for example, if I have the location detail screen here, location detail, and I need to pass the ID of the location we're loading, how am I going to know what ID that is? By defining it up here in Material Route. So there's a solution that we're going to implement, and it's standard Flutter, but it's not like documented very clearly. It's kind of a little bit more a ways into the official documentation. So I don't recommend defining routes like this because they're really, it's just that's the big shortcoming to that. And I hope that explanation makes sense. So let's basically take a pause and implement the location detail screen on how we need to load it, because I can't implement a working example of the location detail screen unless we update it. Now, we went over the fact that the location detail screen right now it doesn't take any parameters. Like, it just loads any random location, right? This is my location detail screen. It just fetches all locations, and then it says whatever first location you have, just load it. So we're now going to have to quickly update the location detail screen to take in a parameter. So let's go do that now. So we're going to have an int as a private member called location ID. Now remember, this is still a stateless widget because location ID, we don't need this data to react to any kind of state changes. It just loads this location ID when it loads, and that really doesn't change. So let's create a constructor now, a custom one, so that we can load the location ID and make an assignment to the private member. So I can call location detail, pass in the ID, and then we're going to need a way to fetch a specific location by ID and then load it here. And we don't have a method for that. So the only methods we have in the location model is just fetch all. So we're going to have to implement a method that closely resembles what we're going to ultimately be implementing, which is a call to our backend service, which fetches a model by ID, identifier. So let's go ahead and implement a function called fetch by ID. So we still have the fetch all, that's going to be used still. But I'm going to implement a static method because we don't need to instantiate a location. And it's going to return a location, fetch by ID, and that's going to be the name of it. And we're going to pass in a location ID. And then what we're going to do is, whenever you implement a function, the easiest way to implement it is just to write out pseudocode. So, and then implement that because it's just easier to implement. So we're going to say fetch all locations, iterate them, and when we find the location with the ID we want, kind of return it immediately. Of course, this is going to get, this is a trivial example, we're going to be replacing it with a backend API call, but it's not an efficient way of kind of implementing this, but it gets the job done for now. So we're going to first fetch all our locations. So we're going to say location fetch all. And then I'm going to have a for loop. And in a for loop in Dart is pretty simple. It looks like a lot of for loops to use in other programming languages. So I don't need to explain too much. So we're going to say iterate all the locations, and then locations I. So the location at index I, if the ID matches location ID, return immediately the location at index I. And I know what you're saying, we can probably load all the locations in a map and it instantly fetch those locations via a map, but this is just a simpler example. So we're going to have now fetch by ID. Now later we're going to be going over, this is an error because we're not haven't fully implemented our screen yet. In the future, you're going to write an actual test for this, and we'll go over testing later. Like, you're not going to just write functions and then just expect them to work. It's best to have a unit test for that, but that's it for another episode. Also, let's move this method down here so that, because it's a little bit more of an explicit method, and we want to show all of this data up here just to make it nicer looking. So now let's implement the location detail. And the location detail screen will call this method. So we're going to say location fetch by ID, and then we can pass it simply our location ID and name it the variable location, and then we can remove this. So now this is working fine. We can instantiates location detail instantiates. It has a location ID automatically, and then when the screen loads, we fetch it by ID. Great. So now let's implement, basically we can't implement push named as I talked to you about, like we have to pass in an actual ID. So I'm going to now go over how to pass in dynamic arguments to the screen we want to load. Okay, so let's implement what we're actually going to be coding at the final implementation of this. So instead of we're not going to use the normal push named. We're going to use a more extended version of push named, and we're going to pass in an argument to push named, which is the ID, the location ID here. So let's implement that now. Before we do that, first I'm going to go to app.dart. And this is how I personally implement this. Like, there's many different ways of implementing routes, but I'm going to have two constants at the top of app, because constants allow me to define, like, refer to location route globally by the actual name without having to, it just prevents mistakes. So I can refer to the location name by an actual like variable name. And in constants in Dart should be starting with a capital letter. So this is going to be in title case. These aren't classes, they're actual variables. So they look like classes, but they're actual variables. But again, they're in title case because they're constant. So I define all the names of my routes up here. I have the home route, which is just slash, and the location detail route. Now, when you pass the slash route to Flutter, it's already going to know, hey, this is my first screen I'm going to load. Great. So now let's go back. And now I can say push named and then locations route. And then I'm going to show you how I can pass an argument to that. So we're going to have to pass this location ID to this push named function. And to pass an argument to it, there's an arguments parameter. So for push named, we have arguments, and all that arguments is a map. So a map type, and then we can define whatever we want here. I can say ID and then location ID. And our screen is actually going to use this, and I'll show you in a minute how it's going to use this. So we're going to refer to it by name, like ID, and then the value, location ID. And we're going to remember that we use this ID key to our map. So let's continue on. So in app.dart, here's what we're going to do. We're not going to use the routes parameter here. So I'm going to remove that. Also, we don't really need initial route because we already have a route called slash, and that just loads first. We're going to use a special parameter called onGenerateRoute. And onGenerateRoute is giving us a dynamic list of routes. It's in the form of what's called a RouteFactory. And a RouteFactory is just a fancy term, which is basically a payload of data. It's a chunk of data that just says, hey, here are my routes. So let's create pass it a function we're going to implement. It's a private function, so it's starting with underscore, called routes. And now we're going to implement that here. Because it's in our app.dart, it's on the highest level, it's easiest to define that here. So it's going to return a RouteFactory. And I'll show you what a RouteFactory is at the end of the day, in a second, rather. And this function is going to return some data. So it's going to return an actual function. So if you click into onGenerateRoute, that is a RouteFactory. Let's click in a RouteFactory. And RouteFactory is actually a function that takes in a bunch of settings and returns a route of type dynamic. So I won't drill into this too much. Let me implement that, and that will make a lot more sense. But what we have to do at the end of the day is return a function. So a function with the parameter settings. So we're going to use settings here, and I'll show you how we're going to use settings. So first we're going to get the arguments to our whatever route was tapped. So arguments, and settings has this member called arguments. So we can use this settings for getting all kinds of information, but arguments is one of them. And now we're going to create a variable called screen, and screen is the actual widget and the final screen that's going to be returned to us based on the name of the route. So the name of the route that we have is defined as settings.name. So if a user taps on whatever they tap on, the given route that they're wanting to reach is defined by the name, which is going to be either slash or slash location detail. And what we're going to do is use a new feature of Dart called switch. And switch it's basically a glorified if and then else if statement. And it can have as many else ifs as you want, but it's just a more concise way of saying if something, and then else if something, and then else if something else, right? So instead of doing that, we can say switch, and we pass it the name of the route. And then I can say, in this case, if it's the locations route, I'm going to do something custom. I'm going to say my screen that I want to return is basically a new instance of the locations widget. And then I'm going to say break, because in a switch statement, it will go through every case until it breaks or you return something. So next case is the location detail route. And remember, every case has to be ended by a colon, not a semicolon. That's really important. And most programming languages have a switch statement. So most of you, if you're familiar with this, this is going to look like second nature to you. So for the location detail route, if I want to navigate to the location detail route here, and that's defined by /location detail, I have to do something custom now. And I'm going to say location detail, and I'm going to use my arguments map here, and I'm going to refer to it by the ID key, and that's what we defined here. So locations, the arguments is a map, and there's a key in that map called ID. You should use single quotes, by the way, by default. And then now I can instantiate it with a custom argument. So now I have my screen. I have to import it real quick. Location detail. Great, and now I can return it. So break, and now the switch statement has this final case, which is if none of the cases match, there's this default case, and you define it with just default colon. And then by default, we're going to return null and do nothing. And then finally, what I'm going to do is return what's called a material page route. And we know that we need to return this because a RouteFactory is a function. And yeah, I won't get into it too much right now, but let me just say that it expects a material page route to be returned, right? And material page route is basically a type of route. So going back to the basically the RouteFactory type, a material page route, basically, I didn't want to get too much into it, but it is a type of route. So you can use any type of route. There's multiple types of route, but the most popular is a material page route. And then material page route takes in a builder. And I wouldn't worry about builder. All it is a fancy way of being able to pass in something dynamic like an anonymous function here. So the syntax is a little weird, but basically it's a function that takes in a context, and you say, okay, what am I returning? I'm returning my screen widget, and that's it. So I know this looks a little weird, but basically this is how we define all the routes in our app that need to be dynamic. And what's nice about it is that it's defined up front in our app widget. So let's get this working, and then I'll show you how it's going to work now. So on generate route is routes. And before we get it working, I'm going to quickly clean this up real quick because I want to use I'm basically going to take my theme data before we get it to work real quick. Let me just tidy this up because it looks pretty ugly. Let me say theme data. Sorry for the tangent here, but I want to just put this here, and I'll show you how easy it is to quickly get this tidied up. Great. So our main screen is very clear. On our app widget, we have just on generate route and our theme, and it's in a method here so that it's nice and clean. Cool. So now that we've gone over that, it was a little tedious, but let's see if this will work. So let's check our code again, push named. Okay, this should work. Let's see if this works. Cool. Now, it's not loading the location detail screen. And see, it's just like loading the location screen. So let's troubleshoot why this is happening. So in our app.dart, location detail, loads the location details, location detail route, and The name we're loading is, see, location detail route. So we have to push named location detail route. So let's hot reload this. And when I click on something, cool, it comes up. So we got it working. I can go back, and when I go back, it will pop it off the route. So there's no, you don't need to implement this pop method. Like, you don't need to manually write some code that says, push this card that's on top of our deck off the stack. It'll just do it automatically because we're using the Material apps, Material Designs app bar widget. So app bar widget automatically will show a back button when the screen appears if it's not the home route. Say, cool. So in our next episode, we're gonna actually implement the beautiful location listing screen, but this is just the nitty-gritty kind of mechanism for navigation. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything, because the blog post basically explains in detail how this is all implemented, and it gives you also links to the documentation. Let's see. Yeah, I guess that's it. Final app.dart file. Cool. And I talked about going back and all that stuff like that. So there might be a better way that you have for implementing routes that are dynamic, that need dynamic parameters. But feel free to reach out if you have a better way of doing this. But for now, and how Flutter is implemented, this is pretty much the most clear-cut way of doing that. Everything's defined up front in app.dart. So thanks for watching, and yeah, on to the next lesson.